Well, I'm very happy to be here today, and I'd like to thank the Queen Victoria Hospital and Interior Health for inviting me to be part of the celebration. Somebody was asking me why we were celebrating again after celebrating a year ago, and I said, well, you can never have too much cake. So that's why we're here again. So we always want to have a reason to celebrate our history, and if we can add a cake to the mix, so much the better. So we're just going to go through and talk about the history of healthcare in Revelstoke, and Dr. Battersby is going to add in a few comments here and there. So we can start off. This is Revelstoke's first doctor. When the community of Farwell was established on Front Street during railway construction in 1885, Dougal Leach McAlpine came here as Revelstoke's first doctor. He's the elder gentleman and the seated in the front row with his rather eccentric family seated around him. The son on this side, Johnny, was a teenager when he came to Farwell with his father in 1885, and he became a doctor as well. And we're now still in contact with Johnny's grandson, who's a lawyer, retired lawyer in Vancouver. When Dr. McAlpine came here, he had his practice on Front Street. But when the rest of his family came, he was a little concerned with having his young daughters in the very Wild West town of Farwell. So he built his family home on an island just down near the west bank of the Columbia River. One of the other early doctors was Dr. McKechnie, who came to Revelstoke in 1896. And in 1897, he established Revelstoke's first private hospital. It was in a small home at the top of Douglas Street Hill. And when Dr. McAlpine from back east, and his family his parents really wanted him to be a doctor, but he wanted to be a farmer. He told his parents he agreed to become a doctor and practice for 25 years. So he did, and then retired and got a farm at Armstrong and became a farmer. But he was very involved in civic politics. He was on Revelstoke's first council in 1899, and he was later given the freedom of the city, and also was given the freedom of the city of Vancouver as well. This was his first private hospital at the top of Douglas Street Hill. There was a story I heard heard a couple of little stories about some of the first patients. There was one story that one of the first patients was a man who was working in one of the lumber camps in the area, and he broke his leg, so he was brought into the hospital. But he was supposed to be, at the time he was in the hospital, he was supposed to be meeting his bride who was coming in from the east on the train. And the plan was they would get married and then go down to their lumber camp where he was working. She got to Revelstoke and discovered that he was in the hospital. And being very enterprising, she found a local minister and brought him to the hospital, and they got married at his bedside. So there was definitely a move afoot to get a public hospital in Revelstoke. And the hospital board was formed in 1901 with the purpose of establishing a public hospital. They were able to get funding through the Victorian Order of Nurses and arrangements that the Victorian Order of Nurses would staff the hospital. So that's why the hospital was called Queen Victoria. And their first hospital opened in August of 1902, where Cooper's is now and where the brick hospital was later built. The first matron was Miss Elsie McKinnon, I believe came from Prince Edward Island, and a member of the Victorian Order of Nurses. She was only the matron for a year because in 1903 she married Thomas Kilpatrick, who was the local CPR superintendent, but he was also the head of the Revelstoke Hospital Board. And he took quite a bit of ribbing from his fellow board members for taking their matron away from him, because of course at that time a married woman couldn't work as a nurse or a matron in the hospital. In 1910 they were running out of room, so they added the brick annex to the original cottage hospital. And later still, within a couple of years, they were really running out of room and needed a more modern facility. So advance to the next one. So they made the decision to build the brick Queen Victoria Hospital that we're celebrating today. So they had the cornerstone laying, of that hospital in August of 1912. The old cottage hospital was moved to the property where the Legion is, and it became after the First World War, it became the First Legion and served as the Legion until 1962 when it burned down and was replaced by the current Legion building. There's the hospital under construction in 1912, and you can see they built it right up against the 1910 brick annex. And construction continues there. And then the hospital was opened on June 18th, 1913. They had what they called it at home at the hospital, and the ladies' hospital auxiliary was in charge of that event. The doctors were giving tours of the hospital, and the hospital auxiliary was collecting goods for the hospital. They were collecting linens and items for the pantry as well. So there was, most of the town came out that day to see the new hospital and to bring contributions towards it. This is shortly after the hospital was opened, the matron Jean Matheson started a nurses training school. And the training school operated from 1914 until about 1935. And there were several nurses who were trained here, several local women and women from the region who were able to come here and get their nurses training. I'll let Dr. Battersby say a couple of words about Dr. Hamilton and Dr. Sutherland.
Thanks, Cathy. I have a particular interest in these two gentlemen, which became apparent to me in 1987 when we celebrated the 75th anniversary of the opening of the courthouse. And it turned out that Dr. Hamilton, or rather Dr. Sutherland, had been the mayor of the day in 1912, giving an address at that time in the original opening. Dr. Sutherland, both Drs. Hamilton and Sutherland spent terms as mayor of Revelstoke. Dr. Sutherland was also an MLA, and he was the original person to say that the Trans-Canada Highway, which wasn't even a thought in people's minds at that time, but that it should go through the Rogers Pass long time before 1962 when it finally went through, I think it was. Anyway, the other really interesting thing to me was that his son was the head of surgery at Shaughnessy Hospital when I did my interning there in my second year of interning. Dr. Hamilton was a colorful person. His son wrote a book of pathology that was the real Bible of pathology at the time when I went to medical school, and to some degree still is perhaps. And when I noticed his obituary in the Globe and Mail a few years back and contacted the family, and subsequently his daughter came, Jane Hamilton, and another sister Mariah, and she brought her children, and so we took pictures of her children with their Dr. Hamilton and Mayor Hamilton's picture from the photo gallery in City Hall. Had that taken at the table, and the kid had the gavel in his hand, so that was a nice momentum. Anyway, it's really been interesting to have that particular contact with the Hamilton family.
This is Ella Rutherford, later Ella Connolly, who was a graduate from the Queen Victoria Nurses Training School. And she was, we'll see a picture later when they did the sod training for this hospital, and she was one of the people that was turning the sod so it was nice that she had that continuity. This is a really cute picture of some of the Revelstoke nurses from about 1919, and we have the names of quite a few of them. There was Miss Gibson, who later became Mrs. Seeger, Miss Robertson, Miss Thomas, who was Mrs. McKay, Miss Amy Smith, who was later McGuire, Miss Falkenbeck, Miss Ura Davies, Miss Fleming, Miss Vera Nelson, who was Turn Ross, and whose name we don't know. And really cute picture of Nurse Vera Nelson with a young patient around 1920. I might have the date wrong on that one. This might be a little early, but Vera Venison, and I don't know the name of her colleague, but they're standing in front of one of the city ambulances.
Right.
And we just did a cute picture of a couple of nurses climbing around with a couple of skeletons. Those nurses like to have fun. And so from the Dickey photograph collection, just a really nice color shot of the hospital. And that road that's going through is what was known as Government Road. And the last vestige of that is that little angle where the bakery and it's now Lower Cole, yeah, where the Lower Cole is now. And the street angled through, originally it angled through, right through to 3rd Street. And so the hospital was sort of built into that angle. So that's a nice shot showing the old building. Early ambulance in the 1920s. And then the ambulance with the driver Joe Farmelo a little later on. There's Dr. Strong, so one of the doctors in town, needed to find a way to get around to his patients in the winter. Most people back then were parked their cars for the winter. It was a bit too difficult to get them around. The streets weren't plowed all that well back then, not to the standards we expect nowadays anyway. And so Dr. Strong had a special vehicle equipped with the tracks and the skis on it so he could get around his patients. This picture was taken around the early 1930s. The hospital, because it was such a beautiful building, was often the setting for a lot of official photographs in town. This was during the Golden Spike days in the 1940s, and the Lieutenant Governor was visiting, so they had a special reception, special photograph taken in front of the hospital. And so another shot from Golden Spike days in the 1940s. Just a really cute shot outside of the hospital of the nurses in a car from that vintage. The Queen Victoria Hospital parade float in when the Golden Spike Days ceremony is probably from 1944 or 45. And we have this a newspaper edition from the 1960s when they were trying to make the decision about where the new hospital was going to be built. There was quite a bit of controversy about it. I don't think anybody doubted the fact that Revelstoke needed a new hospital, but there was a lot of concern about where it was going to be put. There was a newspaper supplement with really making the case for the new hospital, and they had a lot of these photographs of what the hospital, Queen Victoria Hospital, looked like at that time. So these photographs were from the 1960s of the brick hospital. This is the kitchen at that time. And there's the cook, Mrs. Ivy Smith, in that very kitchen. The operating room. I don't know if you want to comment on any of these yet, having used that equipment.
Just to say about the air conditioning, that one of the most difficult things of moving into a new hospital is you couldn't open the windows.
Children's ward in the old hospital. So these photographs were all being used to really make the case for why they needed a new hospital. And the men's ward. I'm hearing a lot of laughing about the men's ward. I bet there's a lot of people in this room who have stories about that, especially some of our nurses here. Do you have anything there?
It was a 15-bed ward, I believe, and I recall one occasion when there was I think it was the Wally Junior School Junior Band was coming back from Calgary to Vancouver, and the bus went off the road just on this end of the park, Mount Revelstoke National Park, and all the patients that we had in that ward we cleared out into other parts of the hospital, we discharged them, and we put all the patients that had to be admitted from the bus accident to that ward, and it functioned quite well. It was I'm sure that the patients found it very interesting.
And this is an interesting photograph because this is Walter Hardman, who was mayor of Revelstoke for almost 25 years, and he was one of the later patients in the old hospital. And there is with Vera Benison, who is a well-known local nurse. So not in his official role there. And Mary Taves was the director of nursing from about 1965 to 1969 in the old hospital. Now this is, Judy Viggen can tell us something about this. This was a parade float that the nurses had in 1966. It was to show nursing past, present, and future. So Judy is the past, Grace Gillespie is the present, and
Sharon is the future.
Sharon Souls was the future. Looks like you were having fun. Did you want to add anything to that, Judy?
Just that all those pins, I did all those pins around there from the training schools in BC. So there's ours and there's Vancouver General and the ones in Victoria, they're all the way around the float.
Great. There was, not too many people realize this, but Revelstoke had an isolation hospital as well for a short period of time. It was built in the 1920s and only operated for a short period of time before it became a private home. And it was on the site that most people will remember as Keith's Chevron, which is on the corner where now is the parking for Cooper's. It was later moved down to 3rd Street West below the Courthouse Hill, and it's a private home now. Now there was a lot of propaganda that was generated on both sides of the argument, pro and against the moving of the hospital. So there were a couple of flyers put out by a local citizens group that was encouraging people to vote against the hospital bylaw. And one again there. And their concern was mostly with the location of the hospital, moving it outside of the downtown. So they did a lot of work on their side, and then there was a whole newspaper supplement in the Revelstoke Review encouraging people to vote yes, and that's where I had all those photographs of the old hospital and photographs of what a new hospital might look like, and encouraging all the different groups that are supporting the new hospital, like the Candy Spreaders and some of the other community groups. So the yes side did win out, and as a result of that, the hospital was built in this location. This was also in that newspaper supplement. It was a different bus crash than the one that Jeff was talking about. This was one that happened in 1967, where there were several people died at the scene, and the rest of I think up to about 15 people were brought to Revelstoke, and how difficult it was to deal with that kind of emergency without even at that time having a proper emergency room. So it was really making the case for a new hospital. And this was the sod trimming at for this current hospital. Can anybody tell me, I know that's Vera Benison on this side, and Ella Connolly is there. Frank Trail. And does anybody know who the other nurse is? I'd have to have a closer look at it. Well, we'll have to have a look at that one later, see if we can figure that out. Who's that?
Was that Eileen Martin?
She was really tall. Eileen Martin was really tall.
We'll have to see if we can puzzle that one out later. Okay. And here we are, our current hospital in December of 1970. And according to one of the newspaper articles, the first child to be born here was Greg Collard. We can continue. Another shot. It's a shot you can't get today because of all the trees that are grown up in the area where the fountain was. And I believe that's is that Ivy Smith and Margaret Gerard. And some of the kitchen staff, Susie Buffaro on this side, and Mrs. Smith, and I'm sure there's some of you can probably identify some of the rest in that photo. Susie Tomorrow? Okay. And this is the hospital administrator, Nick Maynor, receiving a check from June English, who was at that time the president of the Revelstoke Hospital Auxiliary. And I haven't really mentioned the hospital auxiliary, but they're certainly a big part of the hospital story. Right from the time that the hospital board formed in 1901, they formed an auxiliary right away. Because at that time, any of the boards that were formed were all men. And they needed to have a women's auxiliary to do the fundraising and to put on teas and to do any things like getting the supplies for the hospital, having pantry showers and linen showers. That was the women's job. So right from the very beginning, they formed a hospital auxiliary, and they've been working tirelessly for well over 100 years now in this community, and we have a lot to be thankful for that organization and their longevity. It's pretty amazing. There is an interesting little note in one of the minute books from the Hospital Society back in the early 1900s. There was a little bit of infighting amongst the members of the hospital auxiliary from the different denominations. At that time there was Presbyterian, Methodist, Anglican, and Catholic. Those are really the only denominations in town. And so the board, the men on the board, made a policy that there had to be 2 representatives from each denomination on the hospital auxiliary board, so that it wouldn't be dominated by one church group. And I'll let Jeff talk about Dr. Mackay.
Dr. Mackay, when we came here in 1968, Dr. Mackay and Dr. Hamer are the 2 long-standing physicians who've been in the community, and also Brian Hoare, who is here today. He was in practice for 1 year here with us as well. Brian is a retired ophthalmologist from Kelowna now. At any rate, it seemed like I died and gone to heaven when I came to Revelstoke, because I came from Burns Lake and there were 2 doctors and 6,000 people came here, and there were 4 doctors and 8,000 people, but not nearly the demands for service. So just about every morning after we'd either done a consult or something like that and done rounds, Hugh John would sit me down at the hospital and tell me all about what made Revelstoke tick and all the things he'd been involved with. And he was just a great community activist. He was also an active liberal. He was president of the Liberal Association, and Henry Hamer was president of the Progressive Conservative Association. And at one point, the Vancouver Sun sent a reporter up to Revelstoke to talk to these 2 guys and see how they could possibly practice together when they were the presidents of the opposite parties. Interesting thing. But Hugh John was one of the people who was very active in opposing the hospital coming up here on the hill. People might not know that at that time when the hospital was built, the city ended officially at Downey Street, and it was only in boundary extension in 1982 that actually brought the hospital back in within city limits. Because of his active liberal connections, he was instrumental in getting the first palmolive put on Mount Mackenzie, actually, in a national park, because there had been a big blowdown there. And he was able to convince the government of the day that because it was already cleared by virtue of the blowdown, we should be able to put a palm lift up there. So he and others were active in getting that to happen. That's enough of you, John.
I'll just add that Dr. Mackay was on the original board of directors of the Revelstoke Museum Association, so he was very instrumental in getting our museum started. And we have quite a few really interesting medical implements thanks to Dr. Mackay. And Dr. Hamer got a very early photograph of him, and then a later photograph of him that I think most people will recognize. Did you want to say anything more about Dr. Hamer? You guys
He was a really solid guy. And Brian and I were talking today about his smoking habits. Henry Amory would smoke at the desk when he had patients in the office, smoking, walking up and down the aisles in the hospital. And but it isn't my problem in the end. Anyway, Henry was just a great guy and a great mentor, and really appreciate his company. Dr. Armstrong, I think he came, I think in the mid-50s, both Drs. Hamer and Mackay elected that they wanted to each take a year in Britain to do some extra training in surgery. And so Dr. Armstrong came as a locum for those 2 years to work with them. And then once they both finished doing those 2 years, he went on his own and stayed, and was also a very active community person. He was chair of the school board for many years, and certainly his a fond memory, and many patients who are still here in Revelstoke remember him. His son Jerry was a deputy minister in many provincial government ministries over his time. I think he's a sort of a contemporary of Freddie Brewski in terms of age, and is now retired from the public service, but as I say, he was a deputy minister in very many different ministries. Dr. Tom Taylor, in early 80s, well-liked, subsequently moved to Kelowna, and still has a soft spot in his heart for Revelstoke, and with lots of ongoing connection with him. And Mark Longhurst, he was his biggest claim to fame, for which rural communities in this province need to be fair, we're grateful, is that he established the rural medicine practice program at UBC, and it was one whereby students took part of their training out in rural communities, and also there was a family practice residency established too that required you to take 2 years and become better equipped to fill the needs of small communities. So we'll be forever remembered for that going in BC, and then it subsequently spread across the country. Dr. George Woodman, we lost unfortunately not many years ago. Another solid guy, well liked by all, and active in many community things. Dr. Don Morrow is here today, practiced surgery here with us from 72? How long, Don?
When I came here?
Your years, yeah. What were
Yeah,
they?
I was here 5, from 69 till 74.
69 to 74, and then subsequently moved on to Kelowna. Nice to have you here today. Howie Parsons was a locum who came from the east, from Nova Scotia, and he was an avid fisherman, and I think he stayed with us for a full year at that time. And it was many months before he finally caught a fish in Three Valley Lake. That was the crowning time of his time here, was catching that fish finally. And Margaret Brard, whose letter I read to you today. Some other old guy I don't know.
We're ending our show with Dr. Battersby with his retirement day. So I'd like to thank everybody again, and for joining us for this the show. And feel free, if you have any other stories to add, we'd love to hear them. So thank you again.